Kevin here with Fountain Pen Revolution. Today we're going to talk about troubleshooting flex nib fountain pens. If you own any fountain pens that have flex nibs, you might have discovered they tend to be a little more finicky, a little more troublesome than a standard nib fountain pen. We're going to talk about why that is and how you can fix the problem. The first thing I like to tell any customer that buys a flex nib fountain pen is flex nibs are very sensitive about the type of ink used. The reason is any property that's in an ink that can cause the surface tension to break between the nib and the feed as the nib bounces off of the feed. Anything that allows the surface tension to break between that nib and feed will cause ink flow to stop. Therefore, waterproof inks, quick drying inks, sheening inks often don't perform that well in flex nib fountain pens. Sometimes shimmering inks, inks that are meant to not feather. Any inks, I generally say, that have a special property are best to be avoided in flex nib fountain pens. You can try them out, you just might find that they don't flow quite as well as a normal ink. All right, so now let's say you've got your flex nib fountain pen inked up with a good standard ink that you know flows well in a flex nib, but it's not flowing. Let's talk about how to troubleshoot what might be going on there. The first thing that I would check is to make sure that the tipping of the tines is touching. Now there should be a space between the tines themselves on a flex nib fountain pen, but the tipping should be touching. And the way I check that, the easiest way is if you have a jeweler's loupe. You can get one on our website or a number of other websites. You can use a jeweler's loupe to look at the tipping and make sure it's touching. If you don't have a loupe, you can hold the pen up to some backlight and see if you see any light between the tipping. Again, you should see a little bit of light between the tines, but the tipping of the tines should be touching. So let's say you've looked at your pen and you've discovered that there's a gap between the tines. What do? The first thing I would suggest, if it's a pen with an ebonite feed, you can try it with a plastic feed, but it tends to be less effective, especially this works with an ebonite feed. You can heat set the nib and feed. What that means is you take the pen, you soak it in a little bit of almost boiling water for 30 seconds to a minute and allow that feed to soften and see if those tines will close back up again. You can also pull the nib out of the pen and see if the tipping is touching when the nib is out of the pen. If it's not touching when it's out of the pen, it means the pen needs an adjustment. You can overlap the tines and push them back together, and a lot of times you can get that tipping to touch again. All right, so let's say you've got it loaded up with a good ink. The nib tipping is touching. It's still not flowing. What I would suggest then is pull out that nib and feed and give it a very good cleaning. Use some warm soapy water, a toothbrush, pull out that feed, pull out that nib, and just scrub them real good. The reason is even the smallest amount of dirt or debris or oils can cause the ink to stop flowing in a flex nib fountain pen. So you're going to scrub those out real good, you're going to let them dry, you're going to push them back into your fountain pen, and hopefully that's going to fix your problem. Now, sometimes you've got a fountain pen that's flowing great. Flex nib fountain pen, you're flowing great, you've written about 3/4 of a page, and boom, it stops flowing all of a sudden. What happened? Well, one thing to know about any fountain pen is fountain pens essentially breathe. They exhale ink, they inhale air. But with a flex nib fountain pen, sometimes the ink can escape so quickly, especially if you're really pushing hard flexing or you're really writing quickly, the ink can get out of the pen faster than air can get back into the pen, forming an airlock. To solve this, if it's a piston-filled fountain pen, you can simply twist the piston a little bit to release the airlock. If it's a converter-filled fountain pen, you can move the converter a little bit to release the airlock. Sometimes you can simply tap the pen on your pad of paper, or what I find to be helpful is rubbing the back of the nib slit from the back of the pen towards the front of the pen. A lot of times that'll get the ink flowing again. All right, what if your pen is too wet? Too wet generally means too much air is getting into the system. Remember, again, the pen is breathing. If it breathes in too much air, it's going to exhale too much ink. That normally means there's a leak somewhere or your feed has been adjusted to be too wet. If it's a converter-filled pen, perhaps you have a bad converter, perhaps the converter isn't pushed in all the way, perhaps some more silicone grease needs to be added to a part to stop the leak, so that's something to check right there. What if the pen is too dry? Another thing you can do, again, only if the pen has an ebonite feed, and I like to use these little diamond encrusted files. You can take a file, or some people will use a razor blade, and you can slightly widen the channel of the feed. Again, only do that with an ebonite feed, not with a plastic feed. You might also, if it's a little bit too wet, you can try pushing the nib and feed into the pen a little bit more. Sometimes the nib and feed have just slipped out of the pen a little bit. If you push them in a little bit more, it'll cause the pen to write a little bit drier. If none of this helps, if you got the pen from me, please contact us. You might have gotten a defective pen and we would love to make it right. Or if you got it from another supplier, contact them. It is the case that sometimes there are just defects. If you got it from us, we want to make it right. Thanks so much for listening. I hope this was helpful.